Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is City Talk. They were savvy and opinionated. They gave the city its cultural greatness. They played a pervasive role in the shaping of New York City's social, economic, and political structure. They helped build an urban social democracy in New York. They were the heroes of the piece, and now they're seen as a villain. They are the post-war working class of New York. With us is their chronicler, Joshua Freeman. Joshua is a professor of history at Queens College, and he's the author of In Transit, the Transport Workers Union in New York City, 1933 to 1966. He is also the co-author of Who Built America? He is the dean of New York labor historians. He's a frequent commentator on organized labor and union politics, and he now runs the new MA program in labor studies at the Murphy Center here at CUNY. 10 years ago, Professor Freeman published the award-winning social and labor history, Working Class New York, Life in Labor Since World War II. We'll look at post-war New York working class. We'll survey what's happened to New York and its working class over the decades since the book was published, and then we'll take a look at possible and perhaps desirable futures. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you, Doug.
I read this book when it first came out, and I read it again for this interview. I lived this book. I lived part of this book. It really talks to those of us who were born in the immediate post-war period. Let's move to today first. That triggered my desire to talk with you. Where are the American working class? Where is organized labor in the grand scheme of American politics?
Well, compared to the past, it's a lot weaker. I mean, there's no question about it. You know, you just measure it by membership, by its economic clout. Here in New York City, the decline has been much less than in a lot of the country. But even here, you know, particularly in the private sector, unions are much weaker. And this shows, you know, in the tremendous growth of income inequality, in the kinds of economic policies the government's pursuing. So it's not been a good 10 years, really.
And then we'll talk about why New York was exceptional. And you argue that New York City was exceptional because of the existence of this working class. Talk about the book. Talk about the thesis of the book. Who is this working class, first of all?
Well, it's very diverse and very big. New York City was a blue-collar town. I mean, I think it surprises people. It was the greatest manufacturing center, as well as, of course, the finance center. And it had at least at the end of World War II, the dominant group were European immigrants and their children. Now, of course, there were a growing number of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, other groups too. But, you know, this was a city where white Protestants were a minority. You know, there are very few cities in American history where white, you know, it was a big Catholic Jewish working class, a growing African American population, very, very dynamic, kind of feeling its oats and building organizations to promote its interests.
When you say that this working class gave the city its cultural greatness, in what way?
Well, I think there was a kind of vision, you know, a vision of a kind of urbanism. I mean, when you think about the country, most of the country after World War II went in the direction of suburbia, single-family homes, kind of individuation, low taxes, racial homogenation, homogeny. We go the other way.
Mass consumption,
yeah,
right.
Exactly. We go the other way. So it's this highly social, highly collective, mutually supportive kind of a culture that's just vibrant, you know, creative. You think of things from Dion the Belmonts to the New York Philharmonic, and the fact that the same people like both those things. You know, I mean, people go to Frank Sinatra concerts one night, and they go see the Metropolitan Opera, and they go up to Lewiston Stadium, the old football stadium up at City College, and listen in the summer to the New York Philharmonic. So both culturally and politically, it was an extremely vibrant city. And it took the form of institutions. You know, it created that we still have with us. You know, the city university system, free television stations, a huge public hospital system. These were not things that most cities had. That encoded a kind of vision that was really an alternate direction for the country.
Yeah, you talked about at the end of World War II through the 1960s that the working class and organized labor, quote, created a social democratic polity unique in the country in its ambition and its achievements. What were its achievements? I mean, you began to allude to some of them. And what were its ambitions?
Well, I think it was to create a urban way of life in which the kinds of things that Franklin Roosevelt talked about at the end of World War II, guaranteeing all Americans a job, health care, decent education, things that the federal government, in fact, never did do, we did in New York, through a massive public housing program, through working class co-op housing, through a free public higher education program, through a cultural world that was accessible. And by the way, the unions played a role in that. They helped finance New York City Center, New York City Opera, New York City Ballet, the concerts in Lewiston Stadium, a low-cost mass transit system that made all this accessible to anyone. You could live in the far reaches of Brooklyn, and you could go to a free concert in Central Park. So
there existed an ideology or an idea that permeates the entire culture?
I think so. Absolutely. And, I don't want to say it's only working class. There's a kind of progressive reform tradition that coincides with this. And so you see a lot of support for this, actually, from the top, from upper-class reformers, from the Herbert Lehmans of the world. So I think there was a different vision in New York that was not strictly working class, but the working class had the kind of political clout that made a lot of this possible, that made it actually happen.
And that was based on their numbers and their diffusion throughout the economy at that time.
And their organizations.
Okay.
Unions, most importantly, but the American Labor Party and the Liberal Party, which were third parties, which were actually pretty powerful. Tenants groups, block associations, ethnic organizations. So there was a rich organizational life that could be mobilized to support things, for example, like rent control. Rent control was originally a federal program during World War II. Now, most places in the country, it just disappeared.
Right after the war.
Yeah, we still have it, in some form or another. And that was because there was this mass mobilization to defend it.
In some ways, New York post-World War II, as you describe it, is more European than American in terms of its social attitudes and values, at least the way you describe it. And its institutional structure.
Yeah, I think in some ways that's true. The language is different. And in fact, I played around. Did I really want to use the term social democracy? That's not a term that's used here. And by the way, these folks would not have used that term. They would not have used. They would have used.
How would they characterize themselves? How did they see themselves?
Well, I think in the 30s and 40s, many of them thought of themselves as socialist, communist, left-wing. That language kind of disappeared after the war, in part because of McCarthyism and the association with some things that they themselves grew to dislike. So you
Stalin, for example.
Exactly. So you get this often very vague language, progressive, liberal, and I think actually it undersells their achievements because they didn't really have a language to describe how amazing some of the things they did. For example, something like Penn South, a housing project in Manhattan.
Right.
Penn South, which is still thriving today, right in the middle of New York, was built by the union so that garment workers can not only have affordable housing, but they could walk to work. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. Actually, when it opened, President Kennedy came to the opening and Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was a big deal. And yet no one today thinks all that much about it because I don't think there was a language to point out, what was so special and unusual about this.
Well, and in part, your book it certainly at least begins to do that. What would you have liked to have added to the book that you couldn't just because for whatever reason?
Yeah. Well, I think there were certain parts of the social and cultural life that I didn't explore as much as I would have liked to. Religion. I didn't give as much attention to conservative currents that I would have liked to, which are certainly important. And then I think in the more recent period, the explosion of newer immigrant groups and their working class cultures, which is something I sort of point to, but I don't really delve into. And I think that story, some others have begun to tell pieces of it. Roger Sanjak, my colleague at Queens, has written a terrific book about Queens that touches on some of this.
We need a second edition. Come on, with a good epilogue.
We need some, youthful new historians who'll pick up the flame.
So you see New York City, and you use the term throughout, as exceptional, and that there was this exceptional moment, which you alluded to here. But that moment passed. It basically lasts 30 years. The end of the water fiscal crisis.
Yeah. Let me say two things about this. One is, I made a mistake, I think. I overemphasized the exceptionality, and this was I now warn every grad student about this mistake.
Okay.
You do a case study, and then you make a comparison claim, but you didn't really study the other places. So New York was exceptional, but there were pieces of some of the same things in places like Milwaukee and Chicago. So in some of the other industrial cities, Detroit, with strong labor movements, you saw part of it. New York was the most complete version of it. So I think there was an alternative vision that was not just in New York, but we were in the forefront. Since the fiscal crisis, we've become less exceptional, but we're still exceptional, I think. Some of it's the physical form of the city, some of it are the attitudes, but we've become more like the rest of the country.
Well, and then you look at the fiscal crisis and see this as a turning point. You talk about a narrowed social vision became dominant, the public sector was demonized, and corporations exalted. I mean, it sounds like I'm reading today's headlines.
Well, yes.
How and why did this happen? Well, if this was so successful, why were they ultimately so weak in the face of their implacable enemies?
Right. Well, I think there are several dimensions to that story.
Go ahead.
One is it wasn't successful on a fiscal level. This kind of expansive notion of state function could not be financed on a local or even on a state level. You really needed a national orientation in this direction. And in the 60s, with rising municipal salaries, with rising welfare costs, New York City went into huge debt to sustain this expansive notion of state function. And it created a real fiscal crisis, which then became an opportunity for a political intervention by conservatives who said, this is bad idea, it's unworkable, you got to ditch this thing. And I think this really was the beginning of what we think of as the Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of return towards a kind of free market ideology and orthodoxy. And that process has been continuing, for 35 years since.
Talk about workers and unions in New York City today and in the United States. I mean, clearly, as I said in the opening, in some ways, labor is increasingly seen, and particularly unionized government workers are seen more and more to be the villain of the piece.
Right. Well, I think that's true, and I think in some ways they're kind of isolated. One big piece of this, of course, is the decline of the private sector unions, which were once bigger. Today nationally there are as many public employees in unions as private employees. That's a huge historical change. Even here in New York, we think of this as a union town. In the New York metropolitan region, only 15% of private sector workers belong to unions. So the public sector workers now are becoming a kind of real exception. They have benefits that a lot of us no longer have. So that's a kind of source of a certain amount of resentment.
And the whole pension issues as well.
Right, and it's also a sort of target because a lot of private employers don't really like to be in a situation where public employees set a standard that their own workers are not getting. So there's a lot of private sector opposition to these kinds of benefit packages. And it tends to be focused on benefit more than pay. Because in fact, these folks are not that well paid, but they do get relatively generous benefits.
What about their political clout? We're talking about unions now.
Right. Well, that's interesting. The political clout...
Locally. Locally meaning New York City and New York State.
I think the political clout of unions has remained stronger than their economic clout, particularly, again, with the private sector. even just for a second nationally, 25% of voters come from union households. They vote in a higher proportion. New York unions have a lot of influence in Albany. They have a lot of influence in City Hall.
And some would argue that they have too much
Too much.
influence in
Right.
Albany, and that's why you have this fiscal crisis because of these rising pension and
Yeah.
healthcare costs, for example. Respond.
Well, I think the big drop, is really on the revenue side. I think that if you're looking at the financial crunch, which is real, I don't want to minimize it. Starting with Mario Cuomo, and almost ever since we had tremendous decreases in state taxes. If you went back to the tax rates when Mario Cuomo was elected governor, there would be no financial crisis. So, we made some decisions, whether they were right or wrong. So I think
Meaning the political establishment.
yeah, the society, the state,
society,
all
whatever.
of us. I mean,
Okay,
most
all
of us
of-
are not
okay.
too involved in
Right,
it. But,
right.
So I think to focus, on pension costs, which are real. I'm not sort of minimizing it, but I think that's isolating for ideological purposes one side of the story. So unions, still have a lot of power, but it's defensive power now. It tends to be defending what they have, or defending maybe the agencies they work for.
Which puts them in a bad PR position in terms of the dominant narrative really flows against them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I frankly think that most labor leaders aren't very good at making their case. They didn't have to. So I think that they're not politically savvy about how to do that.
Okay, and one of the things that your book does brilliantly, I might add, is look at sort of the giants of the labor movement during the era that I grew up. In fact, I worked for at least one of these folks. David Dubinsky with the garment workers, Mike Quill with the Transport Workers Union, and then Albert Shanker at the UFT. Talk about them and their role and their influence, and compare it to the present day.
Well, first of all, they're household names. I mean, today, I ask my students at Queens College, name a labor leader. Most of them can't name anyone. I mean, some of them sort of know Randy Weingarten. Maybe that's the one name. These were absolute household names. They were extraordinarily able. They were extraordinarily forceful. They were extraordinarily unapologetic in their advocacy for their members and for workers. Some of them, like Quill, were also, incredibly witty, sharp-tongued, quick. So,
Well, he comes from a lot of, as you know, in the TWU, a lot of Irish Republican Army folks were in that union.
Absolutely. They were very politically sophisticated. Even someone like Shanker, who was involved with, young socialist groups. Scott Baum comes out of that same kind of back. They were politically savvy. They came from a working class culture, which was highly politicized. Today, by the way, I think you see that more among immigrant workers. Refugees from El Salvador or Nicaragua, who came to the United States in the 80s and 90s, or refugees from other places today, were often more politically sophisticated than their American-born peers. Back 30 years ago, you saw that in this group. So they were very sophisticated. They were kind of big figures, and they carried a lot of weight. And I just don't think we have very many people nationally or locally of quite the same character, which is not to say we don't have competent folks. I mean, we have a lot, but they don't hold that same position, and they haven't been tested in that same way. And I think we're coming into an era in which they're going to have to be able to step outside the confines of the labor movement and make the case to New Yorkers more generally. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we've achieved. This is why you should support us.
Make the case for them.
Well, first of all, I think the case is against the downward spiral that we've seen in working class standards of living for now, a quarter century. We used to be a society where every year everyone lived better. Now we're a society every year we live worse. And I think the concessionary bargaining, is a managed process of downward mobility. And every group affects every other group. These set benchmarks. The idea that you should be able to work 25 or 35 years and retire on a decent pension, that's in some ways maintained in our society by public sector unionized employees. I think the tendency is we're going to work till we drop. And so we're kind of seeing history go backwards. So some of that seeming ornery, not getting with the program, which seems selfish, and in some ways it is selfish. I don't want, of course,
Sure,
you know,
sure.
but that doesn't mean it doesn't help other people too. You know, so I think that's part of the case that needs to be made. I think also in the public sector, you know, good teachers will be attractive if they're good jobs. You know, and so you know, if you want to attract and retain competent people, you've got to make it not a slum job, you know, not a sweatshop job. And that's true for police and transit and so forth. So I think there's much to be said. There are abuses, and you know, this of course, you know, is terribly costly to the, you know, when you have the lieutenant in the police department in Jersey City who retires with a $250,000 pension, that ain't helping anybody, and it's indefensible, you know, and it's ridiculous to try to defend it.
Okay. Your conclusion in 2000, the end of the 20th century, we're a decade later, I'll read it. You're a bit pessimistic, but you conclude, but possibilities remained as the 21st century begins for ordinary folk through action to turn the ghost of working class New York back into a living organism and allow it once again to play the morally and socially salutary role it traditionally held in the great city. 10 years later.
Well, you know, the labor movement has not been as successful as I would have hoped. I'm a backer of it, but you know, it's not a totally grim picture either. You know, I think probably many people would disagree with me, but I thought that transit strike 5 years ago was an incredibly impressive display of solidarity, not just among the workers, but among New Yorkers who basically supported these workers, who basically said, no, they shouldn't have their pensions cut, no, they shouldn't have their health care taken away. And I thought it was a magnificent display of people.
Is that what happened?
Well, there was look, obviously it was a very controversial event, but if you look at polling, actually, they had a lot of support. You saw it on the streets when Bloomberg, I think in one of his more foolish moments, you know, described his union leaders as thugs, you know. That did not play well, you know. In fact, I thought that was the tide-turning moment. Now, you know, actually, a lot of transit workers would disagree with me. They think, you know, a lot of them think that they didn't do so well in that strike. I think they got a pretty good resolution of it. There are other things too I'd point to. Again, I don't want to be Pollyannish. I mean, it's been a tough period. One of the interesting developments is the growth of non-collective bargaining oriented work organizations, the worker centers, for example.
Talk about this.
Like, for example, the Domestic Workers Union. This is an organization of people who clean houses and take care of children. They don't engage in collective bargaining, which would be a very difficult thing to organize, obviously.
Sure.
But, you know, they have pushed for legislation. In fact, both houses of the legislature passed a bill they've put forward that hasn't been reconciled yet to get basic protections, overtime, you know, minimum wage, health and safety.
Who are the champions? How do they do it? How do they exercise the political muscle or the, what is it?
You know, it's an interesting question. I think that they have been very good in building coalitions. You know, they of course, they have to organize their own group,
Sure,
and they have a good case to make. But I think that they found ways to build ties to other groups, including the Central Labor Council, which, to its credit here, has opened the doors. You know, for example, the Taxi Workers Alliance, which is another one of these groups, doesn't collective bargaining because these taxi workers are in effect kind of independent
Sure.
contractors. They're actually affiliated with the Central Labor Council. This was the first time in the country where a non-traditional union-type group joined the Central Labor Council.
So something's happening here.
Something's happening. Now, will that scale up? I don't know. But it's in the restaurant industry. The New York State Department of Labor has worked pretty closely with some of these groups in terms of enforcing the existing law. You know, we have some pretty good laws in the books. Unfortunately, they're not always enforced about minimum wage, about, you know, overtime, about child labor. So that's an interesting development. I don't know in the end if that model is going to work. But these tend to be immigrants. They tend to be young. They tend to not come necessarily at this with the same assumptions. And I think the labor movement, the old labor movement, if you want to call it that, kind of realizes this is something they need to pay attention to, and they've been fairly open to it. Even another example, kind of a more middle class, the freelancers union.
Right.
You know, with those great signs in the subway.
Right.
You know, that's a very non-traditional model, but I think that's part of the labor movement too.
Now, but what's the underlying ideology here? Is there an ideology that transcends their immediate interests?
Well,
as you argue in the book,
yeah.
occurred between the end of the war
it's a good point you raise. It's not very spoken. Let's put it that way. I mean, the ideology tends to be basic decency. You know,
Right.
Let's get people out of the cellar. You know, it does, though, interestingly, I think, involve looking to government, you know, and the political process more than the collective bargaining employer-employee relationship to upgrade conditions, you know, in part because it's hard to do that for these isolated workers.
Okay.
So it does envision a kind of activist government that is taking onto itself the responsibility to create a floor, you know, for New Yorkers. And that's a very important thing in an era in which we seem to be tumbling downward.
You're in 2010. You've had the advantage of an historical perspective. Looking forward, you just alluded to some of it, but does working class New York ever arise again in anywhere near the influence it once had? And would it be exceptional, as you claim it was?
It would have to be a very different kind of movement. It would have to be of service workers, of white-collar workers, because our economy is so changed. I think we'd have to speak to different interests. So it's never going to arise in the same way. But could workers be more of a force in shaping our city, our politics? I think they could be. It's a tough moment to know what's going to happen next because the context, the economy is so uncertain right now.
And in the last minute or so, what about the Working Families Party? Given its attachment to labor, is it a mechanism for the flowering of this, or is this sort of a standard political operation here?
You know, I think it's both at once. You know, and it's done a lot of good work in terms of getting legislation through that aids workers. It's a very, very impressive achievement. And of course, in the nuts and bolts of politics, they're very good. Their relationship to the Democratic Party, they got to sort out, you know. And sometimes they're a little bit of a kind of adjunct that kind of lines up the troops for the Democrats. Sometimes they're a real pressure group to push these things. So it's a very impressive development, but I don't know yet in the end, is it going to really be very different or is it going to just be a kind of liberal pressure group? That remains to be seen.
So that's the future. We have to see it.
Yeah.
It ain't very clear. But you're still somewhat hopeful.
Well, I am actually. I think labor's always shown a great deal of resiliency, and frankly, you know, one advantage we have is that the upper class blew it. You know, I mean, you know, we live in a city full of financiers who screwed it up.
Okay, you're going to stop right there. We'll leave the blame where we believe the blame may lie. My thanks to Joshua Freeman. Join me next week when Harold Holzer and I will talk Abraham Lincoln. Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.